Most people believe slavery began in America. It's a story repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and debates. But that belief hides a much older and much darker truth. Slavery did not begin in America. It did not begin in Europe. In fact, the system of owning another human being as property existed thousands of years before the first ship ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean. To understand where slavery truly began, we have to travel back in time, far beyond modern nations, beyond medieval kingdoms, and into the earliest civilizations humanity ever built. Nearly 5,000 years ago, along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, one of the first great civilizations appeared. Cities rose from the desert sands. Massive temples towered over crowded streets. Merchants traded grain, metals, and textiles. Kings ruled from fortified palaces. But behind the prosperity of these ancient cities existed another reality, one built on forced labor. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest written law codes in history described people who were not free. They could be bought. They could be sold. They could be forced to work for masters who owned their labor, their time, and sometimes even their lives. These people were slaves. Unlike the slavery that would later dominate the Atlantic world, early slavery often began through war, when armies conquered rival cities. Prisoners were taken rather than killed. These captives were marched back to the victor's city and forced to work in fields, temples, or construction projects. For ancient rulers, slaves were not just workers. They were symbols of power. Every conquered enemy added more labor to an empire's growing wealth. As civilizations expanded, the system spread. In ancient Egypt, along the banks of the Nile River, powerful pharaohs ruled one of the most impressive civilizations the world had ever seen. Massive pyramids, grand temples, and monumental statues still stand today as reminders of that power. While historians debate the exact role of slaves in building Egypt's greatest monuments, there is little doubt that slavery existed throughout Egyptian society. War captives from neighboring lands were often brought back to Egypt and forced into labor. Some worked in households. Others worked in mines or fields under harsh conditions. To the Egyptian elite, slaves were another form of wealth. Owning more workers meant greater production, greater influence, and greater prestige. Yet Egypt was not unique. Across the Mediterranean Sea, another powerful culture embraced slavery even more deeply. In ancient Greece, a society famous for philosophy, democracy, and art, slavery was woven directly into everyday life. Cities like Athens depended heavily on enslaved labor. Slaves worked in homes, workshops, farms, and dangerous silver mines. Some historians estimate that in certain Greek cities, slaves actually outnumbered free citizens. This meant something extraordinary. The freedom enjoyed by many Greek citizens existed only because a large population of enslaved people performed the labor that sustained the economy. But even Greece would eventually be overshadowed by an empire that turned slavery into a massive system of control. That empire was Rome. At the height of the Roman Empire, slavery became one of the most important foundations of Roman society. Rome's armies conquered territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Each victory brought thousands of captives back to Roman markets. These captives were sold like commodities. Men, women, and children stood on auction platforms as buyers inspected their bodies and negotiated prices. Some slaves were trained artisans or educated scribes. Others were destined for brutal labor in mines, farms, or construction. Roman farms, known as latifundia, relied heavily on slave labor. Vast agricultural estates produced enormous quantities of grain, olives, and wine for the empire. But life as a slave in Rome could vary dramatically. Some slaves worked in comfortable households and had opportunities to earn freedom. Others faced unimaginable cruelty in mines or gladiator arenas where survival depended on fighting to the death. The Roman system showed just how deeply slavery could become embedded in a civilization's economy. When Rome eventually fell, slavery did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. Across parts of Europe, the system evolved into forms of serfdom, where peasants were bound to land owned by powerful nobles. Though technically different from slavery, many serfs still had limited freedom and little control over their lives. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, slave trading continued to expand. Across the vast deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, powerful trading networks connected distant civilizations. Within these networks, enslaved people became valuable commodities. Caravans crossed harsh desert routes, carrying gold, spices, textiles, and human beings. For centuries, African, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean markets exchanged enslaved workers who were captured in wars, raids, or conflicts between rival groups. This long history of slavery set the stage for one of the most infamous systems the world would ever see: the transatlantic slave trade. But by the time European ships began transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean, slavery had already existed for thousands of years. What made the Atlantic system different was its scale. Beginning in the 15th century, European powers expanded across the oceans searching for new lands, new resources, and new wealth. Colonies in the Americas required enormous labor forces to cultivate crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. To meet you wake up before sunrise, the air heavy with mist, and the quiet sound of waves touching the shore. For a moment, everything feels normal. Then, the chains tighten around your wrists. A stranger shouts in a language you barely understand, and suddenly your life no longer belongs to you. This is not just a story from one place or one time. It is part of a dark history that stretched across continents and centuries. When people ask who started slavery, they often imagine one nation, one moment, one villain. But the truth is darker and far more complicated. To understand it, we have to go back thousands of years. Long before modern countries existed, early civilizations were already discovering the power of control. In the ancient world, war was constant. Cities fought cities, tribes fought tribes, and the victors faced a question every time they defeated an enemy. What should they do with the people they captured? In many early societies, the answer became slavery. One of the earliest examples appears in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These societies were among the first to build cities, write laws, and create complex economies. Their legal codes describe people who lost their freedom because of war, debt, or punishment. Some were forced to work for years to repay debts they could never truly escape. Others were captured during battles and forced into labor for the families who owned them. In ancient Egypt, slavery also existed, though it often looked different from the brutal systems that would appear centuries later. Many workers in Egypt were not slaves, but laborers who were paid or obligated to work for the state. Yet prisoners of war were sometimes forced into hard labor, building temples, farms, and royal projects. They had no choice, no control over their future. As civilizations grew stronger, slavery became more organized. In ancient Greece, one of the most influential cultures in history, slavery became deeply embedded in everyday life. Greek states depended heavily on enslaved people to maintain their economies. In Athens, slaves worked in homes, farms, and even dangerous silver mines. These mines were among the harshest places in the ancient world. Workers spent endless hours underground, breathing dust and heat, knowing that escape was almost impossible. But perhaps no civilization relied on slavery more heavily than the Roman Empire. Rome controlled vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its armies constantly expanded the empire's borders, and every conquest produced thousands of prisoners. Instead of executing them, Rome turned many into slaves. In Roman society, slavery became a massive system supporting the empire's wealth and power. Enslaved people worked in farms, mines, construction sites, households, and even government offices. Some became teachers or accountants if they had special skills. But many lived extremely harsh lives, forced to work long hours under brutal conditions. Roman markets openly sold human beings as property. Traders transported people from distant regions, selling them to wealthy families and landowners. The empire's giant agricultural estates depended on this labor. Without slaves, many Roman industries would have collapsed. Yet even in this system, resistance existed. One of the most famous examples was Spartacus, a gladiator who led a massive slave rebellion against Rome. For a time, his army of escaped slaves challenged Roman authority and frightened the empire's leaders. Eventually, the rebellion was crushed, but it showed something powerful. Even in the darkest systems, the desire for freedom never disappears. As centuries passed, the Roman Empire weakened and eventually fell. But slavery did not disappear with it. Across different regions, various forms of servitude and forced labor continued. In parts of Europe, systems like serfdom developed, tying peasants to land owned by powerful lords. Although not identical to slavery, these systems still limited freedom and forced people into lives they could not escape. Meanwhile, new trade networks were forming across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Some of these networks included slave trading long before Europeans arrived. African kingdoms sometimes captured prisoners during wars and sold them to traders moving across the Sahara Desert or along the Indian Ocean routes. These systems were complex and varied widely depending on region and time. But everything changed dramatically in the 15th century, when European exploration began connecting continents in new ways. Ships from Portugal and Spain started sailing down the western coast of Africa. At first, they traded gold, ivory, and other goods. Soon, however, a far darker trade began to grow. European traders discovered that enslaved labor could produce enormous profits in the new colonies they were establishing in the Americas. Plantations growing sugar, tobacco, and later cotton demanded huge numbers of workers. Indigenous populations had already suffered devastating losses due to disease and violence, leaving plantation owners desperate for labor. This demand created what became known as the transatlantic slave trade, one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Over the next several centuries, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The journey itself was terrifying. Enslaved people were forced onto crowded ships in chains, packed tightly below deck for weeks or even months. Conditions were brutal. Many suffered from disease, starvation, and abuse. Some did not survive the voyage at all. Those who did reach the Americas were sold at slave markets to plantation owners and traders. Families were separated, names were changed, and identities were erased. For countless individuals, the life they had known was gone forever. Plantation economies in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America grew incredibly rich through this forced labor. Sugar plantations, in particular, became extremely profitable, but they required exhausting work in dangerous conditions. Enslaved workers cut sugarcane for long hours under the burning sun, often facing violent punishment if they slowed down or resisted. Despite the brutality, resistance never disappeared. Some enslaved people escaped and formed communities known as Maroons in remote forests and mountains. Others resisted in quieter ways, slowing their work, preserving cultural traditions, or secretly teaching their children the languages and beliefs of their ancestors. Over time, voices began to rise against slavery. Philosophers, religious groups, and activists argued that no human being should own another. Abolition movements grew stronger, especially in Europe and North America during the 18th and 19th centuries. Eventually, many countries began passing laws to end the slave trade and later slavery itself. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. The United States ended slavery after the Civil War in 1865. Other nations followed over the following decades. But ending slavery on paper did not erase its legacy. Generations of exploitation left deep scars across societies, economies, and cultures. The consequences are still visible in many parts of the world today. So when people ask who started slavery, the answer is not simple. Slavery was not invented by one country or one culture. It appeared in many civilizations throughout history, shaped by war power and economic greed. What makes the transatlantic slave trade stand out is its massive scale and its global impact. It connected continents, moved millions of people against their will, and reshaped entire societies. Understanding this history is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. Because when we look honestly at the past, we see more than cruelty and injustice. We also see resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human desire for freedom. The story of slavery is not just about those who lost their freedom. It is also about those who fought to reclaim it, generation after generation. And their struggle reminds us that freedom is never something to take for granted. The most powerful empires in human history were not built by kings alone. They were not built only by armies, generals, or brilliant leaders. Hidden behind the rise of many great civilizations was something darker, something most history books mention only briefly. A system where millions of people lost their freedom so that empires could grow stronger. When people ask who started slavery, they often expect a simple answer. A single country, a single culture, a moment in time when everything began. But history does not work that way. Slavery appeared again and again across different civilizations, spreading wherever power, conquest, others are, and wealth demanded cheap labor. To understand how deeply slavery shaped the world, we must look at the empires that dominated ancient history. Thousands of years ago, along the Nile River, the civilization of ancient Egypt rose from the desert. The Nile flooded each year, bringing fertile soil that allowed farmers to grow crops and feed a growing population. Over time, powerful rulers known as pharaohs united the land and built one of the most remarkable civilizations the world had ever seen. Egypt's temples towered over cities. Massive statues guarded sacred places. And of course, the pyramids rose from the desert like mountains built by human hands. These monumental projects required enormous amounts of labor. Many workers in Egypt were farmers who worked on state projects during the flooding season when their fields were underwater. But Egypt also captured prisoners during wars with neighboring regions. Those captives were often forced into labor. Some worked in agriculture, others in quarries cutting massive stones used for temples and monuments. They were not free to leave. Their labor belonged to the state and to the powerful elite who ruled the land. For the pharaohs, slaves represented both economic power and military success. Every conquered enemy added more labor to the empire's workforce. Across the Mediterranean Sea, another civilization was rising that would influence philosophy, science, and politics for centuries to come. Ancient Greece became famous for thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It was also known for early democratic systems, especially in the city of Athens. Yet behind the image of intellectual brilliance and political freedom was a society heavily dependent on slavery. In Athens and other Greek city-states, slaves performed many of the tasks that kept society functioning. They cooked meals, cleaned homes, worked on farms, and crafted goods in workshops. Some were skilled workers who helped produce pottery, metal tools, and textiles that were traded across the Mediterranean. One of the harshest places for slaves in Greece was the silver mines near Athens. These mines were dark, cramped, and extremely dangerous. Workers spent long hours underground, digging through rock to extract silver that funded the city's economy and military power. The irony was striking. A civilization remembered for its ideas about democracy and freedom depended heavily on a population that had neither. Eventually, Greek influence declined. Others call it a new empire rose that would dominate the ancient world for centuries. Rome. The Roman Empire expanded across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Roman armies were disciplined and powerful, capable of conquering vast territories. Every time Rome defeated an enemy, thousands of prisoners were taken. These prisoners were rarely released. Instead, they became slaves. Roman slave markets were busy and widespread. Traders brought captives from distant regions and sold them in public auctions. Buyers inspected them closely, looking at strength, health, and skills before deciding how much to pay. Some slaves were fortunate enough to work inside wealthy households. They might cook, educate children, or manage household accounts. A few even gained positions of trust and influence within Roman families. But many others faced extremely harsh conditions. Large agricultural estates, known as latifundia, relied heavily on slave labor. These farms produced grain, olives, and wine in massive quantities. The work was exhausting, and discipline was often brutal. Other slaves were sent to mines or construction projects where life expectancy was short. Some were forced to fight as gladiators in arenas where crowds cheered as men battled for survival. Despite the danger and oppression, slaves in Rome sometimes resisted. One of the most famous rebellions in history was led by a gladiator named Spartacus. Captured and forced to fight for entertainment, Spartacus escaped and led thousands of fellow slaves in an uprising against the Roman Republic. For a brief period, the rebellion terrified Roman leaders. An army of former slaves moved across the countryside, defeating Roman forces. Eventually, the rebellion was crushed. But the story of Spartacus became a lasting symbol of resistance against oppression. As time passed, the Roman Empire weakened and eventually collapsed. Yet slavery did not disappear with the fall of Rome. Instead, it evolved into new forms. In medieval Europe, a system called serfdom became common. Under this system, peasants were tied to land owned by powerful nobles. They were not technically slaves, but their freedom was extremely limited. They were required to work the land and give part of their harvest to their lords in exchange for protection and the right to live there. While Europe developed this system, other parts of the world continued using more traditional forms of slavery. Across North Africa and the Middle East, trading networks connected distant regions. Caravans crossed the Sahara Desert carrying gold, salt, textiles, and sometimes enslaved people captured in wars or raids. Along the eastern coast of Africa, trade routes across the Indian Ocean connected African communities with markets in Arabia, Persia, and Asia. In some cases, enslaved individuals were transported along these routes to work in households, agriculture, or military service. These systems were complex and varied widely depending on the culture and region. But one thing remained constant. Slavery continued to exist wherever power and profit demanded it. Everything changed dramatically during the 15th century, when European explorers began sailing farther across the oceans. Nations like Portugal and Spain searched for new trade routes and new lands to claim. Eventually, these voyages led to the discovery of the Americas by European explorers. Soon after, colonies began appearing across the Caribbean, South America, and North America. These colonies were built around plantations, growing crops like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. These crops generated enormous profits in European markets, but they required huge numbers of workers. Plantation owners needed laborers who could survive long hours in difficult conditions. Indigenous populations were initially forced to work, but disease and violence drastically reduced their numbers. As a result, European traders increasingly turned to Africa. Over time, a massive system developed connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system became known as the transatlantic slave trade. European ships brought manufactured goods to African coastal regions. Their traders exchanged those goods for enslaved people captured during wars or raids. Those captives were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean in crowded ships. The journey was known as the Middle Passage, and it was one of the most brutal voyages in human history. Enslaved people were packed tightly below deck, chained together in dark spaces with little air or sanitation. Disease spread quickly, and many did not survive the crossing. Those who did survive arrived in the Americas, where they were sold to plantation owners. Families were separated, identities were erased, and millions of lives were permanently changed. Over several centuries, millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Their labor produced wealth that fueled the growth of powerful colonial economies. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, enslaved people resisted in many ways. Some escaped and formed independent communities hidden in forests or mountains. Others preserved their languages, traditions, and beliefs despite efforts to erase them. Eventually, growing movements began challenging the morality of slavery. Writers, religious leaders, and activists argued that no human being should own another. These ideas slowly spread across Europe and the Americas. By the 19th century, many countries began abolishing the slave trade and eventually slavery itself. Laws were passed ending the system that had dominated so many societies for centuries. But the legacy of slavery did not disappear overnight. Its effects shaped economies, cultures, and social systems for generations. When we look at history honestly, we see that many powerful empires were built partly on the labor of those who had no freedom. Their stories remind us that the rise of civilizations often carried a hidden cost. And understanding that truth helps us better understand the world we live in today. More than 12 million people. That number alone is enough to stop anyone for a moment. Imagine 12 million lives, 12 million families, 12 million stories. Each person with a name, a home, a childhood, dreams for the future. Now imagine all of that suddenly taken away. When people talk about slavery in history, they often focus on powerful empires, famous leaders, and major events. But behind every statistic, there were real human beings whose lives changed forever. And the numbers connected to slavery are some of the most shocking in all of human history. To understand how massive this system became, we must begin with one of the most infamous chapters in history, the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 15th and the 19th century, historians estimate that more than 12 million Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. These men, women, other children were taken from their homes, separated from their families, and sent to lands they had never seen before. But those numbers only tell part of the story. Many people never survived long enough to reach the ships. Some died during violent raids on villages. Others perished during forced marches from inland regions to coastal trading ports. By the time captives reached the ships waiting on the coast. Countless lives had already been lost. Once aboard the ships, the situation often became even worse. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was known as the Middle Passage. It was one of the most terrifying and brutal experiences imaginable. Enslaved people were chained together and placed in cramped spaces below the ship's deck. The ceilings were often so low that many could not even sit upright. Rows of bodies were packed tightly together. There was little fresh air, almost no sanitation, and limited food and water. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Fevers, infections, and exhaustion weakened many captives during the long voyage. Some ships carried hundreds of enslaved people at once. The journey could take weeks or even months, depending on weather conditions and the route taken. During that time, suffering was constant. Historians estimate that millions of people died during these voyages before ever reaching the Americas. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced a new reality waiting for them. When the ships finally arrived, upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved people were taken to markets where buyers gathered to inspect them. Plantation owners, merchants, and traders examined the captives carefully, judging their strength and health. Families were often separated during these sales. Parents were taken one direction, while children were sold somewhere else. Husbands and wives were forced apart, sometimes never seeing each other again. Once sold, enslaved people were sent to plantations where their labor became the foundation of colonial economies. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were among the most demanding and dangerous places to work. Sugar was an extremely profitable crop, but it required constant labor. Workers spent long days cutting sugar cane under the intense tropical sun. The process of turning sugar cane into sugar involved grinding, boiling, and refining the plant in extremely hot environments. Injuries were common, and exhaustion was constant. Cotton plantations in North America also relied heavily on enslaved labor. Cotton became one of the most valuable crops in global trade during the 19th century. The demand for cotton in textile factories in Europe created enormous profits for plantation owners. But those profits were built on forced labor. Enslaved workers planted, harvested, and processed cotton day after day. Their work schedules were tightly controlled, and punishments for disobedience could be severe. Yet despite the harsh conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist. Some attempted to escape. Throughout the Americas, small communities of escaped slaves formed in remote areas such as forests, mountains, and swamps. These communities became known in some regions as maroon societies. Living in difficult terrain helped protect them from capture. Some of these communities survived for many years, creating their own cultures and systems of self-governance. Resistance also appeared in quieter forms. Enslaved people preserved songs, languages, religious traditions, and stories passed down from their ancestors. These cultural practices became powerful symbols of identity and survival. Even small acts of resistance, such as slowing work or secretly helping others escape, became ways of challenging the system that tried to control every aspect of their lives. Over time, the numbers connected to slavery continued to grow. Millions were transported across oceans. Millions more were born into slavery in the Americas. Entire economies became dependent on this system. But as the system expanded, so did opposition to it. By the late 18th century, abolition movements began gaining strength in Europe and North America. Writers, philosophers, and religious leaders argued that slavery was morally wrong and should be abolished. Formerly enslaved individuals also played a crucial role in these movements. Their first-hand stories revealed the cruelty and injustice of the system. Activists organized campaigns, wrote books, gave speeches, and pressured governments to change laws. Gradually, public opinion began shifting. In 1807, Britain passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade. British naval ships began patrolling parts of the Atlantic Ocean to intercept slave ships. Other countries followed with similar laws. However, even after the slave trade was outlawed, slavery itself continued in many places. In the United States, slavery remained deeply tied to the economy of southern states. Tensions between those who supported slavery and those who opposed it eventually contributed to the American Civil War. When the war ended in 1865, the United States officially abolished slavery. Similar changes occurred in other countries during the 19th century. Brazil, one of the last countries in the Americas to abolish slavery, finally ended the practice in 1888. Although these legal changes marked the official end of slavery in many parts of the world, the impact of the system remained. Generations of forced labor had created deep economic inequalities. Cultural traditions carried memories of both suffering and resilience. The descendants of enslaved people continued facing challenges long after the laws changed. When historians examine the numbers connected to slavery, they see more than statistics. They see a system that affected millions of lives across continents and centuries. The numbers reveal the enormous scale of human suffering, but they also remind us of the strength of those who endured it. Despite unimaginable hardship, enslaved people preserved their identities, protected their communities, and fought for freedom in ways both large and small. Today, when people ask about the origins of slavery, the answer cannot be reduced to a single moment or place. Slavery appeared in many societies throughout history, but the transatlantic slave trade stands out because of its enormous scale and lasting global impact. Understanding these numbers helps us understand the true weight of history. It reminds us that behind every figure in a history book were real people whose lives mattered. And remembering those lives is one of the most important reasons history continues to be told. Imagine waking up one morning, thinking your life is your own, only to discover that everything you value, your family, your home, your freedom, has been taken from you. Imagine being forced to leave your home, walk for miles under the hot sun, and then be sold to strangers who treat you as nothing more than property. This is the human story behind slavery, a system that has existed for thousands of years in many civilizations across every continent. When people ask, "Who started slavery?" they expect a simple answer: a single culture, a single event, a single villain. But the truth is far more complicated. Slavery didn't begin in one place, and it didn't begin in the Americas. It existed long before modern nations, long before Europe or Africa were even defined on a map, in countless societies that sought to expand power and wealth at the expense of others. In early human history, war was common. Armies conquered neighboring tribes and cities, and the victors faced the question, what to do with the defeated. Many captives were enslaved, others were killed. Slavery, in this context, was often a result of conquest. It was about power and control, not just economics. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations, written law codes describe people who became slaves because of debt, punishment, or war. Families could be separated and individuals forced into labor for years, sometimes decades. They built canals, worked in fields, and labored on construction projects that allowed early cities to flourish. In these societies, slavery was not just an economic tool, it was a symbol of dominance. Kings and wealthy elites used forced labor to assert power, expand their cities, and secure their legacies. Ancient Egypt provides another example. The pharaohs, masters of one of history's most remarkable civilizations, relied on labor for their monumental construction projects. Temples, pyramids, and massive statues were built with the help of workers who were often prisoners of war. Some labored in households or on farms. Others were forced to work in mines or quarry stones under harsh conditions. While not all Egyptians were slaves, those who were represented both economic value and the pharaoh's control over conquered territories. Meanwhile, in Greece, the contrast between freedom and slavery was stark. Athens, celebrated for philosophy, democracy, and culture, relied heavily on enslaved labor. Slaves worked in homes, farms, workshops, and the notorious silver mines. Life was difficult, dangerous, and often deadly. The paradox of Greek democracy existed, because while free citizens enjoyed rights, those rights were supported by the labor of others with none. Rome took slavery to an entirely new scale. Roman armies conquered vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Captives were brought back and sold in massive slave markets. Some became skilled artisans, household managers, or teachers. Others were sent to farms, mines, or gladiator arenas, where survival depended on strength, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. The empire's wealth, culture, and power were intertwined with the institution of slavery. Even in such oppressive systems, resistance persisted. Spartacus, a gladiator, led a massive revolt that threatened Rome itself. Though ultimately crushed, his rebellion became a symbol of courage and the unyielding desire for freedom, showing that even in the darkest conditions, humans resisted oppression. When Rome fell, slavery did not vanish. In medieval Europe, serfdom tied peasants to land, restricting freedom and forcing labor for powerful lords. Across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, slavery persisted in various forms, often as part of established trade networks spanning deserts, rivers, and oceans. Captives continued to be exchanged, sold, and forced to work under harsh conditions. The 15th century brought a dramatic shift. European exploration connected continents in new ways, leading to the colonization of the Americas. Plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton required vast amounts of labor. Indigenous populations had suffered from disease and violence, so European colonists turned to Africa to supply the workforce. Others began the transatlantic slave trade, one of history's largest forced migrations. Millions of Africans were captured and transported across the ocean in the brutal Middle Passage. Packed tightly below decks, chained together, many succumbed to disease, hunger, or abuse. Those who survived faced sale at markets, separation from families, and a lifetime of forced labor on plantations. Yet, even in these conditions, enslaved people resisted. They escaped, preserved traditions, and passed down stories and knowledge, keeping their identity alive despite centuries of oppression. Over time, abolition movements grew stronger. Religious leaders, philosophers, and activists challenged the morality of slavery. Formerly enslaved individuals told their stories, exposing the cruelty of the system and inspiring change. Laws were passed, and by the 19th century, slavery was outlawed in most parts of the world. But its legacy endured, shaping societies, economies, and cultures for generations to come. The story of slavery is not about one nation, one people, or one moment in time. It is a human story, repeated across centuries and continents, defined by struggle, resilience, and the unyielding desire for freedom. Every enslaved person resisted in some way, large or small, and their courage reminds us that freedom is never granted. It is fought for and cherished by those who survive oppression. Understanding this history is essential. It shows that the fight for freedom and justice has always been part of the human experience. And it reminds us to honor those who endured and resisted, ensuring that their struggles are never forgotten. Imagine waking up one morning, thinking your life is your own, only to discover that everything you value, your family, your home, your freedom, has been taken from you. Imagine being forced to leave your home, walk for miles under the hot sun, and then be sold to strangers who treat you as nothing more than property. This is the human story behind slavery, a system that has existed for thousands of years. In many civilizations, across every continent. When people ask, who started slavery? They expect a simple answer, a single culture, a single event, a single villain. But the truth is far more complicated. Slavery didn't begin in one place, and it didn't begin in the Americas. It existed long before modern nations, long before Europe or Africa were even defined on a map, in countless societies that sought to expand power and wealth at the expense of others. In early human history, war was common. Armies conquered neighboring tribes and cities, and the victors faced the question, what to do with the defeated? Many captives were enslaved. Others were killed. Slavery, in this context, was often a result of conquest. It was about power and control, not just economics. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations, written law codes describe people who became slaves because of debt, punishment, or war. Families could be separated and individuals forced into labor for years, sometimes decades. They built canals, worked in fields, and labored on construction projects that allowed early cities to flourish. In these societies, slavery was not just an economic tool. It was a symbol of dominance. Others call me in wealthy elites, used forced labor to assert power, expand their cities, and secure their legacies. Ancient Egypt provides another example. The pharaohs, masters of one of history's most remarkable civilizations, relied on labor for their monumental construction projects. Temples, pyramids, and massive statues were built with the help of workers who were often prisoners of war. Some labored in households or on farms. Others were forced to work in mines or quarry stones under harsh conditions. While not all Egyptians were slaves, those who were represented both economic value and the pharaoh's control over conquered territories. Meanwhile, in Greece, the contrast between freedom and slavery was stark. Athens, celebrated for philosophy, democracy, and culture, relied heavily on enslaved labor. Slaves worked in homes, farms, workshops, and the notorious silver mines. Life was difficult, dangerous, and often deadly. The paradox of Greek democracy existed because, while free citizens enjoyed rights, those rights were supported by the labor of others with none. Rome took slavery to an entirely new scale. Roman armies conquered vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Captives were brought back and sold in massive slave markets. Some became skilled artisans, household managers, or teachers. Others were sent to farms, mines, or gladiator arenas, where survival depended on strength, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. The empire's wealth, culture, and power were intertwined with the institution of slavery, even in such oppressive systems, resistance persisted. Spartacus, a gladiator, led a massive revolt that threatened Rome itself. Though ultimately crushed, his rebellion became a symbol of courage and the unyielding desire for freedom, showing that even in the darkest conditions, humans resisted oppression. When Rome fell, slavery did not vanish. In medieval Europe, serfdom tied peasants to land, restricting freedom and forcing labor for powerful lords. Across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, slavery persisted in various forms, often as part of established trade networks spanning deserts, rivers, and oceans. Captives continued to be exchanged, sold, and forced to work under harsh conditions. The 15th century brought a dramatic shift. European exploration connected continents in new ways, leading to the colonization of the Americas. Plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton required vast amounts of labor. Indigenous populations had suffered from disease and violence, so European colonists turned to Africa to supply the workforce. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade, one of history's largest forced migrations. Millions of Africans were captured and transported across the ocean in the brutal Middle Passage. Packed tightly below decks, chained together, many succumbed to disease, hunger, or abuse. Those who survived faced sale at markets, separation from families, and a lifetime of forced labor on plantations. Yet, even in these conditions, enslaved people resisted. They escaped, preserved traditions, and passed down stories and knowledge, keeping their identity alive despite centuries of oppression. Over time, abolition movements grew stronger. Religious leaders, philosophers, and activists challenged the morality of slavery. Formerly, enslaved individuals told their stories, exposing the cruelty of the system and inspiring change. Laws were passed, and by the 19th century, slavery was outlawed in most parts of the world. But its legacy endured, shaping societies, economies, and cultures for generations to come. The story of slavery is not about one nation, one people, or one moment in time. It is a human story. Most people believe that slavery started in one place at one time with one nation. It's a story repeated over and over in textbooks, documentaries, and debates. But the truth is far more complex and far more unsettling. Slavery was not invented by a single culture. It existed almost everywhere, across thousands of years, and shaped the course of human history in ways we are still trying to understand today. To grasp this truth, we have to look beyond the myths. We have to look at the origins of slavery in the earliest civilizations. Thousands of years ago, societies along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what we now call Mesopotamia, were among the first to develop cities, governments, and written laws. In these societies, slavery was already part of everyday life. People became slaves through debt, punishment, or conquest. Families were separated. Lives were controlled by others, freedom was a distant dream. Meanwhile, along the Nile River, ancient Egypt rose to become one of the most remarkable civilizations in history. The pharaohs built pyramids, temples, and monumental statues. Behind these achievements, however, were people whose labor was forced. Prisoners of war, captives from distant lands, and others labored in the fields, mines, and households. They were enslaved. Their toil built empires. Their stories were rarely recorded. Yet their existence was essential to the wealth and power of Egypt. In the Mediterranean, Greece became known for philosophy, democracy, and culture. But the freedoms celebrated by Athenian citizens depended heavily on the labor of enslaved people. Slaves worked in homes, farms, workshops, and silver mines. They endured harsh conditions, long hours, and little hope of freedom. Their lives enabled citizens to pursue art, politics, and intellectual endeavors. Democracy existed for some, while others were denied the most basic rights. Rome took this system even further. The Roman Empire spanned continents. Every victory in war brought prisoners who were sold in public markets. Slaves worked in households, farms, mines, and arenas. Some fought as gladiators, risking life and limb for the entertainment of spectators. Large estates, called latifundia, depended entirely on slave labor to produce crops, wine, and olive oil. The empire's wealth, culture, and power were inseparable from the system of slavery. Even in such extreme oppression, rebellion, and resistance emerged, exemplified by Spartacus and his army of escaped slaves. For a time, they challenged the might of Rome itself. When Rome fell, slavery did not disappear. Across Europe, forms of servitude evolved into serfdom. Peasants were bound to land and owed labor to their lords. Across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, trade networks carried enslaved people across deserts, rivers, and seas. In every era and region, slavery adapted to the needs of those in power, shaping economies and societies around the world. Then came the era of European exploration. In the 15th century, ships sailed beyond familiar horizons, connecting continents in new ways. Colonies were established in the Americas. Plantations grew sugar, tobacco, and cotton, crops that generated immense wealth, but required vast labor forces. Indigenous populations had been decimated by disease and violence. European colonists turned increasingly to Africa. Captives were sold into slavery. Transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage and forced to work in brutal conditions for generations. Millions suffered, millions perished, but resistance never ended. Escaped slaves formed communities in forests and mountains. Others preserved their languages, religions, and cultural practices despite attempts to erase them. Across centuries, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, both large and small. Their courage and resilience remind us that humanity cannot be fully controlled. Even under the harshest conditions, the truth is undeniable. Slavery was not invented by one people or one nation. It appeared in many societies throughout history, taking different forms depending on culture, geography, and economy. The systems varied, but the essence remained the same: one human controlling another, stripping them of freedom, dignity, and agency. Yet the story of slavery is not only about oppression. It is also about resilience, courage, and survival. Every act of resistance, every preserved tradition, and every story passed down to future generations represents the enduring human desire for freedom. Today, when we look at history honestly, we see a pattern. Wherever power, conquest, and economic gain exist, systems of oppression emerge. Slavery is not a relic of a single culture. It is a warning, a mirror reflecting the darkest and brightest sides of humanity. Understanding this truth changes the way we view the past and the present. It reminds us to honor the countless lives stolen, yet also to celebrate the unbreakable spirit of those who resisted. Freedom is never guaranteed. It is earned. It is defended. It is remembered. And finally, the real truth emerges: slavery has no single origin, no single inventor, no single moment in history. It is a human story, a story that stretches across continents, centuries, and civilizations. It is a story of suffering, yes, but also a story of hope, resilience, and the eternal fight for liberty. When we remember this, we do more than acknowledge the past. We give voice to those who were silenced. We learn, we reflect, and we commit to ensuring that the horrors of history are never repeated. Because the history of slavery is not just a tale of the past. It is a lesson for every generation that follows. And that truth is one that cannot be ignored.